cloud. Perfect. Well, welcome everyone to our second session in the Socialism 101, the Communist Manifesto education sessions that we're doing. The first one was on the Communist Manifesto. That one has already been posted to our YouTube, and you can find that at our YouTube channel at K-State YDSA. This one is about the Paris Commune, and particularly the history surrounding the writing of the Communist Manifesto and what kinds of social movements that it inspired in France at the time. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mikey. Your go. Tell us all about the history of the manifesto.
Oh, yes. Hello, everyone.
Oh, can you get closer to your microphone when you're speaking, just FYI?
Okay, I'm already all the way
That
over.
works.
Hello. Can you guys hear me now? Are we good? Cool. First off, I would like to know who did the reading, and let's go around the room. How much of the reading did you do of the Utopian Socialism and the Communist League, and what was a takeaway that you had? Sarah, would you like to go first?
Okay, I get to go first. I listened to, because I don't know the titles, but one second.
The first one is the Utopian Socialism.
Yeah, so I listened to the Paris Commune, the socialism, the chapter, the Utopian Socialism, and then on the history of the Communist League, I just skimmed it. I'm gonna be honest. I didn't really digest anything from that, if I'm being completely honest. One thing, I guess my takeaways, specifically the Paris Commune, I thought they were every 5 minutes there was a quote in there that I was like, it's a good quote right there. There was just a lot of I was like, okay, yeah. I think there was one, oh, I'm gonna butcher it, so I'm not even gonna try, but maybe I can find it while the other people are talking. But that's what I thought.
I'll go ahead and go next. I've read Engels's Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific, the whole thing before, and so I got a brief reintroduction to it, watched a summary video on it to make sure I was up for today. And you can also note that utopian socialism is mentioned in the Communist Manifesto. So if you remember our discussion from last time about the differences in that kind of thought, we're going to get a little bit more into that today. And then with the history of the Communist League, I didn't spend much time on that because I was focused on the the Paris Commune stuff. So I didn't pay as much attention to the Communist League. So I would love, some more information on how they were working as a international organization.
Yeah, I just realized I did not do the reading on Paris Commune, so
I think that's okay because you're doing the Communist League stuff. I'm doing the Commune. It's fine.
I was not thinking about actually doing the reading for your half of the discussion.
I think that's fair. My big takeaway is particularly the way that we need to do self-reflection. I thought that it was really elucidating how much self-criticism is clear in Marx and Engels' work. And I know a lot of people, even that video I showed in the last session about the manifesto, was like, oh, Marx is writing so angrily. That this is an angry document. It's if you read it as an organizer, someone who's experienced in organizing, you understand that is self-criticism. That is what we should be doing, and how we should understand and think about ourselves to an extent, and then we should move forward with something constructive, and that's what our political program should provide. So that was what I got from it. This vibe of self-criticism that's really helpful.
Yeah. Gabe, do you want to go next?
Sure. Let me pull up the list again. I listened to the audio of the Paris Commune, and then I read the first chapter, the Utopian section of Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific. And then I read a little bit of the Civil War in France section. And that was probably my largest kind of critique of the whole thing, especially the Paris Commune, the first part, because I'm not really an expert on French history. I know just kind of the basics. And so I was constantly having to like pause the video and look up stuff like, okay, when did this happen? Like, who is he referring to? Trying to track it. And also doesn't help that there's been like 4 different French republics and several different French empires, and 2 of the emperors were both named Bonaparte. One was the nephew of the other one. And so in my head, it was very difficult, and I had to keep on pulling like, okay, when did the French Franco-Prussian War happen, and when did this happen? So keeping track of all that. But once he actually started talking about the Commune, that was really interesting. And I also couldn't help, but I'm a huge fan of the musical Les Mis, which is kind of based around that, and so I kind of had that in the back of my head. But it just made me think of like there's a lot of promise there that just ended up not being fulfilled due to like outside forces stopping it. But I just kind of left, thinking almost kind of like disappointed of like it could have done so much more if if they had allowed the Paris Commune to reach other parts of France and things of that nature. But
Yeah. William?
I'm going to be honest and say that really the most I did was start on the Paris Commune, but so that's my bad. But I think from what I did read, I think I found interesting is how Marx sort of analyzes kind of the evolution of sort of the political apparatus of France. I think he talks about how however, he talks about right, the bourgeois Republicans had from the front to fall back to the rear of the party order. So I think he's referring to basically sort of a regression with the bourgeois forming in 1848 the establishment of the government, how that sort of backslided into sort of right a more reactionary character. I think one of the another important point is just sort of what the text itself has in bold, or at least the Marxist.org has in bold, but the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes. So I think the takeaway is it's a shame that the commune did much, but it's a shame it couldn't do more, and that the commune it had fatal flaws. Yeah.
Nat? You're...
Yes. I'm not sure how far I actually got, but I started the full text of the Civil War in France before cutting over to the summary. I read the Paris Commune and the chapter of Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific the closest, and I believe I comprehended the first half of the history of the Communist League before giving up out of exhaustion. Takeaways. I think taking my time with these articles and chapters has started to inform me on how exactly to do Marxist analysis in terms of historical materialism. And a lot of what I was reading rhymes with current events, so some of it was a bit scary.
Yeah. Okay. You guys, I don't know if anyone has taken any history classes, but I'm a history major, so I'm very familiar with how historians talk about history and how to read history and all that kind of thing. And I'm also familiar with the style of class that I prefer in history teaching, but you guys are not. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an intro to how I would want a socialist education session
Can
to
you
go.
speak louder if possible?
Yeah, sorry. I'm just sorry. Yeah, anyways, so I would like you guys to talk like to each other. I hope I have a better understanding of these things, of the material than you do, but obviously I'm also learning right along with you. But I would like you guys to discuss the material, and I will jump in when I feel like that the conversation is getting off track, or if there's a point that needs clarifying or that kind of thing, or if you guys all run out of steam and are like, we can't, we don't have anything else to say, then we'll jump in and I'll talk about that. So that being said, the main key that I felt for getting to the meat of the text that we're reading is asking ourselves, what is the author, what is the thesis of the author, and what is the author trying to portray in the text? And so we can go. So let's start by talking about the.
I have a question for.
Yeah. Yeah.
So are we talking about one of the texts in particular? Because I know, like, you were.
My next sentence, Sarah.
Okay.
Yeah. Let's do the chapter, the Utopian chapter first.
I'm gonna pull it up
in the reading, to provide the ideological context, and then we'll get into the Communist League, because so let's talk for experiences of the Reign of Terror. 10 minutes. See what you guys think is the point, is the thesis of that chapter, and what it's sitting at.
So just to be clear and stated for the video, it's chapter 1 of Engels' book, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. The chapter is entitled The Development of Utopian Socialism.
Okay. Cool. Yeah.
Oh, yes. This is the one that talked about guys, I'm not smart, so just bear with me. But this is the one where it talks about socialism works if you have reasoning. It was heavy on reasoning. You know what I mean? I thought that was it doesn't rely on religion, or I forget the other thing that it said to stray away from. But I don't know, I thought that was interesting. I feel like that would go more with scientific, but maybe I need to read that chapter too to get it. But you know what I mean? I assume that the next chapter is scientific socialism because of the title of the book, but
yeah, as far as I understand, this chapter is supposed to elucidate one particular kind of socialist thought that's happening at the time, which is something that Engels is criticizing, right? That utopian socialism is something that we should not be following, and that is something that leads to ruin in socialist thought. It is this, and I think that the key is that he references people like Robert Owen. He references the broader French philosophers and starts talking about French philosophy, which I mean may also speak to his German biases and this talking about how because at this point in time he's very proud to be German. So is Marx and some of these other German communists. They're kind of opposed to a lot of the French and their lofty goals. I mean, let's think about the Enlightenment thinkers of the time. It'd be Locke and Rousseau and these other French Enlightenment thinkers that are arising and influencing a lot of the Republican thought at the time, and what eventually becomes the foundations for U.S. Constitution and Republican democracy. So I just found it interesting. This is connecting to what I was thinking about earlier about how this is not an angry document. This is just him going all of this stuff does not work. It is not good enough for us as socialists. We can do much better.
Another thing that I think was like a key part, I think, so you talked about how he's criticized utopian socialism, right? It's like too ideal. We shouldn't go by it. And I think one of the reasons he brings up at some point is like, I don't think that utopian socialism takes in materialism into account enough. Like that doesn't take into like the actual conditions of what people are in, because like obviously like you're not going to get utopian socialism because of whatever. That is such a bad way to word it. I hope you guys understand my sentiment though.
Yeah.
Gabe, William, or Nat, how did you, what is your, like, what is the thesis you think Engels is getting at in this chapter?
To me, it kind of seems that my understanding is that utopian comes from philosophy, and then the scientific comes from like more hands-on, so-called empirical evidence, and building on that, like the actual mechanisms of how everything works. My personal opinion is I kind of wonder, stealing a little bit from dialectics, is like if there can be a synthesis between the two. Is that could you like what's to stop someone like focusing, but because it also seems like utopian is much more personal based and trying to convince this singular person to become, communist or socialist or follow this movement, versus scientific is much like larger in scale to then influence people. But it's like, why can't you have both? And what's the saying, like shoot for the moon and you land amongst the stars type of thing. Like, is there a problem with having loftier ideals but at the same time realizing that the world is messy, and so to reach those there is like a practical like method of how we reach them? So that's my personal opinion though.
Yeah, I think that's really big. The question about where on the spectrum of utopianism and not scientism, but like scientific approaches or empirical approaches to socialist thought in particular. I think Engels actually, I think it's Marx that elucidates this. He probably is the one writing the section on it in the Manifesto, where they talk about how it's not that these French socialists are like necessarily doing something bad. It's that they're doing something wrong. It's that it's incorrect. It's that it doesn't have it on its own some kind of like moral character. It's that the outcomes of utopian socialism is incorrect. So, for example, they talk about how they will put on the aesthetics of socialism and then do things like they'll do things like advocate for feudalism. So this isn't necessarily a utopian socialist idea, but it's like feudal socialism, as Marx describes it in the Manifesto. Marx and Engels describe it in the Manifesto, is the idea that bourgeois capitalism is bad. Therefore, we should return to feudalism. Socialism at the time just meant opposition to capitalism. So when Engels is saying utopian socialism, he does mean a particular category of thought that's like, and this is a great quote right here. If pure reason and justice have not hitherto ruled the world, this has been the case only because men have not rightly understood them. What was wanted was the individual man of genius who has now arisen and who understands the truth. That he has now arisen, that the truth has now been clearly understood, is not an inevitable event, following the necessity in the chains of historical development, but a mere happy accident. That like we can just like spontaneously, as we think about ideas, eventually someone will have this ultimate utopian socialism where we will have this perfect thought. And like that's what Engels is really talking about here. And I think you kind of elucidate that, Gabe, when you're talking about like where's the line on the spectrum. It's like the utopians think that there is no real spectrum, that the whole thing is this fuzzy cloud of nonsense, and that somebody will find the right point somewhere. Whereas the scientists, if you will, are the ones who are pushing in the direction of like, okay, even if we're not right, that like, our goals are not lofty enough. at least we are doing something toward our goals. At least we can achieve them, because this like sort of spontaneous navigation of the cloud is not enough.
Yeah. I know I said 5 minutes ago that I was going to not talk, but I've changed my mind. We're all the same person. This is a group discussion.
We're all the same person.
We are a hive mind here at the YUSA. We're equal. We're equal. This is an egalitarian organization. I was gonna jump off your point, Gabe, that Engels in this piece, he's not, condemnatory of, he doesn't think utopian socialism is the way, but I don't think he's like mean about utopian socialism, and in that, I think the point is that there was a time for utopian socialism, and in the 20s and 30s, the people who were utopian socialists brought a lot of interesting ideas to the forefront. Like, he makes this point where he's like, Robert Owens did all these things in his factory, and when he was doing these things within the confines of this factory, all these, nobles and all these important people wanted to come see what he was doing. And then as soon as he started criticizing capitalism, no one ever talked about him again, and he, these things where he is, so in that way, there's a time for utopian socialism. In the same way, there's a time for utopian socialism in every person's political development, because I don't think most people get into, many people don't get into politics or socialism because they are just convinced on the pure facts of the economic theory of socialism that it's going to, that everything's going to work out. They're it's a more idealist kind of notion of how to change the world. And then
yeah, I guess I've always kind of lumped it in together with the New Age movements that happened during the 60s and 70s, with the typical hippie commune, things like that, which obviously they didn't make any actual impactful change, but at the same time, the people involved with those movements still had these ideas of communism that they were, on a very small scale, which ultimately failed. They were trying to do something, and so it's one of those things where I think, yeah, at the end of the day, you do need to actually control, property, means of production, the actual large scale to actually get anything worthwhile done. But you also need to convince people and put those ideals into people to make them want to participate, I guess. And because if you just focus solely on the economics, like you said, it's not going to convince the average person to, you need to make them want to participate in this, I think, and that's a good idea.
Yeah, the only pushback that I offer is, of course, I think, now, or at least in a group like this, right, we of course identify that there are, there's extreme utility to a lot of scientific socialism, and that when it comes to utopian socialism, we have to recognize and be able to self-criticize the moments when we are spending way too much of our energy sort of pontificating or doing things like counterfactuals, like, what if this hadn't happened? How much time can we spend and energy thinking about what the world would have looked like had these changes been? Whereas what Marx and Engels really ask us to think about in these texts is, what is happening now? Where are we here? That's what they say when they say the proletariat sort of gets control over the present. That the communists and the Communist Party get control over the present and not the past, where the bourgeoisie owns the past. That's their distinction that they make in those texts that I think is really helpful for understanding this. It's obviously we understand that we have more in common with, say, figures like Abbie Hoffman, who did a lot for anarchist and communistic thought in the 60s, making it more popular and palatable to a lot of young white college kids who were protesting the Vietnam War. Like that, he was really, really popular for a lot of them, but he was also bought into a lot of ideas about utopian socialism, where he was hoping for the day that there would just be enough workers to be pissed off at the government that it would spontaneously form into this like worker cooperative system, or enough people stealing from stores that capitalism kind of like falls down, and then somebody builds socialism from the ashes. And it's like, now we have to be ready to critique those ideas and move the line forward to something that's effective. William says, what's the name of that hippie? That's Abby Hoffman. Abbie Hoffman, Hoffman. You can find him by searching the book called Steal This Book. Abby is like also a feature in the trial of the Chicago 7, short dramatization that's on Netflix. So you can watch both of those and kind of get an idea on who Abby Hoffman was.
Side note, that's one of my favorite movies of all time, is the Trial of Chicago 7. Banger movie.
Yeah, I feel like we've hit on the key points of this section and placed utopian socialism in its historical context preceding the Communist Manifesto. I feel like we understand what is the things of how utopian socialism and I mean I do think utopian socialism is a reaction to the current conditions. Like, I think he says this, that it is a reaction to the conditions of capitalism that are emerging. And so in that way, it's a form of socialism. It's just like Marx hadn't been there yet to iron it all out in 1820. So yeah, I feel like we have an understanding of that. If we would like to move to the history of the Communist League, I know this was a like denser piece, but I think I took some things out of it about the state of communist organizing and in this period, and how that might relate to current or future communist organizing, and how but also how the manifesto got written, and yeah, and the material circumstances which led us to today. Yeah. Who else has thoughts about the Communist League? Who else had heard of the Communist League before I assigned this reading? Daniel, I know you did, but
I did.
Yeah.
Nat, tell us what was your view on the Communist League, or like just like any thoughts, or like what was your takeaway on the Communist League before doing this reading and doing this like perspective on the reading?
I didn't have much of an understanding of exactly what the Communist League was, aside from it being the first which Marx and Engels took a pretty central role in leading. I believe they was the first international separate from the Communist League, or was the Communist League part of the first international? Because the first Communist League was fairly international in character.
I think it was the first. Yeah, it is. The organization stands as the first international proletarian organization. That's Communist League, London, 1847.
Okay, so they're different terms for the same organization. Okay. When I initially heard of it, I thought it was a little short-lived, but didn't know how it came about or why it fell apart. I was surprised to learn from the reading of how many attempts at revolution happened around the same period as the February Revolution in France, 1848. Coming out of that was the Second French Republic. Try to keep all this straight.
No, you did great. Thank you.
Yeah, that's one thing I learned during doing this thing is just that they were just having revolutions like all the time. In the 1800s, and that's part of what Engels and Marx are talking about, how capitalism, the transition between feudalism and capitalism was unstable, and Sarah, I don't want to call on people because we're not in a classroom setting. We're just trying to.
Well,
talk.
I was just trying to show that I could raise my hand, but anyway, I have it pulled up right here. And one thing that I don't know if it was at all on your like agenda to talk about at all, but it says demands of the Communist Party in Germany. Number 3, universal arming of the people. What do we think about that? Do we have
I think I might guide this part just a little bit. I think the many of the demands of the First International are definitely, honestly enough, let's not forget that most of the demands of any of these communist parties are going to be radical for their times, no matter what. Like literally giving women suffrage, radical. Like involving all men, even just like universal male suffrage. That was radical.
Mm-hmm.
Because you had to be property owner in order to vote for most of these previous republics and things like that. So like the first 3 or so French republics.
That puts it in a different context. Under feudalism, you were restricted with the certain weapons that you could have on your person. So, I don't know exactly what the laws were in Europe, but you couldn't have such long a sword if you had. Obviously, it's very expensive. It's very expensive to have these weapons, so they were a status of nobility, and I think that's kind of what it means that right now there's a class difference between who has weapons and who hasn't, which obviously means that some people have power and some people do not. But this is kind of trying. The demand is like, get rid of that shit. Like we want weapons too. How are we gonna do revolution if there's no weapons?
True.
Yeah, and we're gonna talk a lot about weapons when we get to the Paris Commune, because that actually is like a big feature of why the Commune was both successful and why they were able to get where they were. So I think
my assumption with like number 3, the universal army of people, is very similar to our Second Amendment, where it's like talking about a well-armed militia is, I don't have it pulled up, but it's necessary for the state or whatever. And it's like they didn't foresee it was very much something of the period, and there's no way that they could foresee like modern warfare. And so to just having a gun in general was being sufficiently armed, to cause a revolution, but also protect yourself. It's a complex thing. But I mean, even looking at number 1, the whole of Germany shall be declared a single individual, individual republic. It's like Germany didn't even exist at the time, and you had all these revolutions and all this. So I always take a lot of those with a grain of salt when I'm like, why were they asking for the people to be armed? And it's like, well, these were all like mini, almost like city states, and there was revolutions going on, and the Franco-Prussian War was going on, all these different things. And it's like, well, of course, in those circumstances, they would want everyone to have, guns.
Did anyone else, William or Nat, did you have takeaways from any of the reading that you did do about the Communist League? I think Nat, you should probably start first. Like, you said there were some differences that you had after, like, before thinking about it, and some after. Is there anything else you'd like to add? Any other things that you thought of that were different or changed your thoughts about the Communist League?
No, the difference was prior I was just more ignorant, and after reading about it, got an idea of the history around that league and awareness of what forms it took up leading up to Marx and Engels actually joining to reorganize and publish the manifesto. It was renamed to the Communist League. By the time it was renamed to the Communist League, its previous name was what? The Communist
The league,
Education?
it was like two groups that came together, and it was like the League of the Just and like
Yeah. So yeah, just nothing really to add, just awareness of the history.
Yeah.
I had a question, I guess, based off of the Communist League document and that whole idea. Is it beneficial then to have, I'm not up to date, who knows, maybe there is more recent internationals, but is it beneficial having a so-called global or multinational like communist party sort of thing, or is it better to have like national party? Because I mean, for other parties, there's no such thing, they're all like national or even regional. And so I was just wondering like what the benefit of having like a larger multinational international party would be.
Yeah, Mikey, do you want to talk about like the why is the international happening? What's the context here?
Yeah, I think in this period, I mean, he says it in the manifesto. There is no country for the workers. The workers have no country. That they are realizing that they have this this connection as workers. And another thing I think is clear in the document is that there is a lot of travel of workers going to other places. He says that like every worker in London or in France is a German worker. So there's like these immigrant workers who are realizing that they have more in common with the workers of other countries than they have with the bourgeoisie of their own country. Another thing that I think is kind of interesting that I thought was just kind of funny is that like they're in Europe, so they're all in these little tiny countries. So whenever they're being hassled by the police, they just like go into another country, and and the police can't find them. So I thought that was really funny. Even though they do eventually, like 5 of them eventually do go to prison, so there's like serious, very serious stakes. But yeah, I think that's basically the reason. And obviously, when you get into this is not of this period, but when you get into later periods, the second and third international are very important. And so I think that's basically why the communists tend to have an international movement, because they see that even though communists are often at the front of national movements, a lot of these, he says that a lot of the revolutions in 1848 are headed by communists, but because the communist league isn't very formed, the demands of those movements aren't communist because the masses aren't there yet, essentially. So communists are involved in national struggle, but communists should also be international in there, and I kind of have to be international in their outlook.
Yeah, it's both in thought and in material reality. Like love the section about workers like, finding more in common across borders than even within them, right? Obviously they're not going to find much commonality with the factory owner as they will the other poor worker in, Berlin, right? It's interesting to see how you mention the part about how like communists are not leading this communist international. Like the Communist League itself is not leading the First International. Like in the sense that when they call themselves like this Communist League, it is what is referred to by Trotsky and Kautsky as the United Front or the Popular Front. These are an organization that is a popular front for broadly anti-capitalist views in a similar direction, similar but not the same as the YDSA or DSA as like broader big tent organizations, where they're trying to capture this broad left energy or broad anti-capitalist energy, but have no direct or no required sort of line or approach to that struggle. And so their hope is that by coordinating this struggle across these diverse views from people all across these different countries, that the hope is that they can, build a broader and a better working revolution. So I find it particularly interesting when you read in Utopian Utopian Socialism, that stuff that we just got done talking about. You hear about like name dropping after name dropping after name dropping of these different French philosophers, which were influential on workers, but also were influential on the different workers' parties. And so some of them were even members of these parties, like the Communist League, as Engels is describing. So it's like you start to see the current as you're reading through the Communist League and learning more about what they do and who's a part of it, right? And you hear about their history. You start to see that current also happening later that we'll talk about with the Paris Commune, about like why this divergence in thought causes both successes and problems for these communist movements. Gabe, does that answer your question?
It does, yeah. I was trying to think of what the practical benefit, because there was also that section where it seemed like everyone that I think Marx referenced it or someone else, that all these foreign people that were like in London or someplace else, they end up all just going back to their hometown, the draw of their home, happened. And so I was just kind of wondering, and also after the trials, the whole league just fell apart and things of that nature. And so I was just thinking like, okay, like what's the feasibility of having like an actual international organization, so to speak? But
Yeah, I think that bit of there's a bit of the reading that towards the end when the whole revolutions are when it's all kind of crumbling and they're kind of seeing the writing on the wall, they send a bunch of the members back home to Germany and to where they're from, just because they can't be anywhere near the league itself because they know I think they know that it's all going to go down. So they send everyone back to, or is it? See, this is how history is hard. You don't ever I'll remember everything. Anyways, I think it might also be it's during the revolutions they send everyone back, and those people are like to like spread communism there, and a bunch of the people it just doesn't like work out because they're like, well, they've all moved away. There's not enough time to like get anything off the ground before the whole revolution like starts. Yeah, but I think that the commitment of the people who are in these groups is really extraordinary, because obviously 11 of them are on trial for like treason, on trial for treason, and like 5 of them go to prison. So, and they're like meeting in like secret cells. One of the things I thought was interesting was that he said that they had like an open organization, the like Working Men's Association, and then the secret organization, the Communist League, and they would like recruit from the Working Men's Association to the Communist League. But sometimes it was illegal to have the Working Men's Association, and when they couldn't have a legal Working Men's Association, they would have like sports clubs or like choral societies or just like activity kind of groups that would become for working men that would be a recruitment. So I just thought that was interesting, and it's not something you ever hear talked about when people talk about the 1800s, how much political repression there was, because people will talk about dictatorships in the 20th century and talk about the political repression there, but no one ever mentions that the political repression of the dictatorships in the 20th century is a complete retread of the political repression that existed in the 1800s and earlier than that. But people have a vested interest in making you think the 1800s were better than they were. So
Yeah, I do want to talk about the material conditions of that secrecy for just a moment. Like, I don't know if you noticed while reading some of the first part of the Communist League, you're hearing these, these musings of people coming together and like forging, a path forward, and they're all debating about like how to move forward as communists. Like, what does that mean, and what are our demands? And then it comes to questions like, okay, arming all of the proletariat, for example, is like necessary and important for resisting the tyranny that's going on. If you think about the time that we're talking about, the period that we're talking about, and granted, the Communist League doesn't span this whole period, but we're talking about generally the period from about 1830 to 1848. And so this is a time that comes off of the heels of a lot of big turmoil in the French government, in French politics, and also in the German government, the Prussian government and its politics, because they're in war. Like, wars are actively happening, there is conflict and violence around people. And so it's interesting that that it isn't until Marx and Engels you see in the beginning of the manifesto where Marx and Engels write, a specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. And it's like, okay, where's this specter come from? It's the Communist League is this hidden, secret society of the working men who are working together as a sort of coalition across these countries to orient these working men's associations toward the direction of communist goals. And so when we're talking about like, okay, how do we do an action? Are we doing this public? Are we doing it private? How are we responding to this? How are we going to interact with other organizations? Like, they were trying to answer these questions with live fire, and it was, it was a struggle. It was a real struggle for them. That's another like part of the answer to your question, Gabriel, about like international versus like just national or just local kind of politics, is that they were not really sure about the answer to that question themselves. Like, this was an organization, a secret society of men who had like who understood, hey, I think we all agree on this stuff and we're generally working well together. But they also didn't have many of these details figured out, and were just trying to figure them out as they were going along, in a lot of ways. So it's good to have international association, but we also have to recognize that they did find a lot of commonalities because of the common material situations that they were experiencing, and also lots of differences because the kind of political repression that was happening in France changed very rapidly, given there was like monarchy and then a republic and then a different republic, but that supported and reinstated a monarchy, and then a war they were fighting. And so it's like the different regimes changed the way that they could respond, which very much affected things like the manifesto, which is like, hey, we need to publish these things publicly if we are going to convert all of the working men's associations to our platform. Essentially, is what Marx says in the intro to that book. Marx and Engels say in the intro.
Yeah. Does anyone have any questions or final thoughts about how the Communist Manifesto came out of the Communist League generally? Because obviously that's what we're trying to figure out.
I think I remember reading once, I could be again completely mistaken, but I think one of the reasons why the manifesto was written in the first place was to actually start as a different document of like question and answers. Like, so when you were talking to somebody who was like a potential communist or something like that, almost like an identifier, you could ask them a question like, what do you think of this? And then there's a proper response, like this is the correct response to that question, kind of thing. And then like, yeah, we need a better way of going back about it. And so like, here's the actual manifesto, and you can just say like, this is exactly what we believe in, rather than having like a question and answer type document.
Yeah, the Engels document, The Principles of Communism, is an early draft of the manifesto, and it's something that we will, we're going to consider like requiring as reading as part of the YDSA and like included in a lot of our programs because it is a very very simple outline, and you can even see the Principles of Communism document has paragraphs that are then written in the manifesto, like verbatim. So it's funny to see that you see this document like, oh, very simple answers to simple questions, right? And then you go read the manifesto and you're like, oh my God, this answers even so many more questions. And so it's like that's the goal that Marx and Engels were trying to get at was like, don't forget all this utopian socialism, this like head in the clouds, this like spontaneous movements, this anarchism was also really big in French politics because remember, they were anti-capitalist and anti-bourgeois, which means they were largely against the formations of the republics. But it also meant things like feudal socialism, where people are like, we should return the monarchy so that we can have feudalism again, because honestly, this capitalism stuff's not working, right? But like we felt safe under feudalism, or utopian socialism, where they say we need to have these loosely associated, badly associated local politics of anarchism that will, hopefully maybe be able to manage a whole economy. Who knows? Like that's their kind of approach, as in like Proudhon and Blanqui, and I'm going to talk more about these later. But like that's the setup for a lot of the things that are happening leading up to the manifesto. Is there's so many clashes of these different kinds of thoughts all coming together, and that they really they know what they're doing in the sense that they're like successful in some of these achievements, but then they keep getting held back by these changes in government, these political repressions, these differences across borders that are just hard to navigate.
Well, if we feel like that is a stopping point, then I will hand it off to Daniel, and I can learn about the Paris Commune because I didn't do the reading. So,
Yeah, William or Nat, do you have anything else you'd like to ask about the communards, if you will? I know I'm using that term loosely, and some historian would bonk me over the head for using that term to describe the Communist League right now, but I'm going to call them the communards because I think that word's fun.
Oh, good.
Cool. Okay. Well, we're going to talk about the Paris Commune. Now, the setup to this is, remember, we just talked about the 1830s and 40s. So we know that there's this quite tight knit group, the Communist League, within these working men's associations that are all across different places. This kind of looks like now where there's a lot of vanguardist independent parties for socialism, like the PSL, the ACP, the CPUSA. You don't have to know what any of these terms mean. These are just acronyms that I'm listing because I know a lot of them. But there's lots of loosely associated groups who are involved in things like union organizing. There's lots of DSA members who are also union organizers in the UAW. There's lots of PSL members who are organizers in their teachers unions or things like that. There are lots of organizers at the college and even the national level who are broadly involved in labor unions and labor organizing, who are a part of various sects and groups of socialism across the United States. And um, so when we consider that situation in the 1830s and 40s, it's not too dissimilar from the United States now, where we have to think about giant geographic area, lots of different material experiences and cultural experiences across the United States, both with political repression, with the way the governments are structured, the susceptibility of liberals to like listen to socialist thought, the combination of like republicanism, the lack of democracy, or the changing in voting rights or access to elections. Like we are facing a lot of those similar kind of like cross-border differences that were being felt at the time, at least as far as I understand. So in the 30s and 40s, you have these big uprisings, a combination of wars. You have changes in governments that happen quite rapidly. As you may note from reading the document, they're revolting all the time. The workers are not happy. Even the bourgeois are not happy. Most of these revolutions are largely bourgeois in the sense that they are not in the interests of the proletariat. They do not identify themselves with the proletariat. They identify themselves with some ideal version of a republic, of an enlightened populace, of the perfect economy, or whatever those things may be. And they are not, communists in that sense. And that's why in the Communist League, you read about how like the Communist League is not leading a lot of these efforts, but is rather tailing a lot of them, or working with them in some way, kind of on the side. And it's even written in, I think it was Phil Gasper's edition of the Communist Manifesto. He's pretty specific in his section at the top of the manifesto, where it says the specter of communism is haunting Europe. All the Europeans are scared of communism. Like, he literally says in his own annotation, he's like, hey, actually, Marx and Engels are kind of overstating it here. In the 30s and 40s, the Communist League is not like the big threat. The big threat is actually bourgeois Republicans who are trying to upset the monarchies in places like Spain and Portugal and France and Germany. So given that 30s and 40s context of political unrest, of war, of difficulty, toil, and whatnot, the workers are pissed. Marx and Engels want to capture on that energy and explain that this is now the time to no longer be secret. We are not doing enough. We need to move forward. And so they write the manifesto. And you've just heard about the Communist League and some of that other stuff. And now you know that the manifesto was written in a context where like this is genuinely the first time that communists are like out and proud and in the open. And this is part of why the YDSA broadly says that we are like, or at least our chapter likes to say that we are unapologetically socialist, right? That we have to say that we are socialist and be forward and upfront about that, because it's what allows us to then make the second claim of like, here's what socialism means and here's why it's cool and awesome and all these things. And it's like, if you spend all your time in these secret societies, how are you supposed to convince the masses? Okay, so we've got the 30s and 40s. The Communist Manifesto is written. Now we've got a gap. The Paris Commune does not happen until 1871. So what happened? What happened between 1848 and 1871? And the big answer, because I'm going to play a little clip of the intro here. The spoiler alert: it's war. War happens. In 1848, largely the uprisings and movements and revolutions that were happening at the time got crushed by the bourgeois government. Because of that crush, the Communist Manifesto actually doesn't get printed the way it's supposed to. If you notice in the intro of the manifesto, Marx and Engels say that they're going to translate it into like 6 different languages and distribute it through all the countries. None of that ever happens, actually. The first time that it gets like retranslated is not for another decade and a half. Out of German into, I think it was like German and French got translated at some point, but really the big work of translation didn't happen until well after the Paris Commune. So most people had to know German in order to even read the Communist Manifesto, which is another note to like remember about that time, that like the manifesto was not big yet. It didn't really have a whole lot of sway. I'll show the clip. Let's get into some of the historical context, and then we'll go into discussion shortly thereafter. I'll probably pause the clip a couple of times and see if y'all remember anything from the readings or if you'd like to make comments. So let me make this known. Let's do screen 1. Share. Okay. Y'all can see this screen? Okay. There's that terrible video, but I'll have to play it later. Okay, this is from the Red Menace episode on the Civil War in France. Brett and Allison are great on this analysis, and I will pause it multiple times, both for copyright issues, but also just because like there's some things I want to comment on. I want to be clear. If you want to learn more about the Civil War in France from an analytical perspective, from like a theory perspective, watch this episode. It is really, really good. If you want to learn more about the history and the like historical context of the Paris Commune, watch the Rev Left Radio episodes on the Paris Commune. There's a couple of them, and one of the big ones is where he invites one of the biggest translators on the Marxist archive. He's the one who translated all of the like big works that you know of that we've been reading on the Marxist archive. He's the one who like learned the original French and German to translate those and make them into English so that they're accessible to all of us. So really cool episodes to watch if you want to learn more. Let me make sure my computer sound is on. Can you all hear this? No?
I didn't
Okay.
hear anything.
Got it. let me reshare. Share sound. Okay. So I skipped the first portion where they talk about the Franco-Prussian War. This is really, really important. They basically, Prussia, which is the most of Germany and is like the German Empire, if you will, at the time, is warring with France and has been for a long time since the Napoleonic Wars and since a lot of the stuff that was happening in France with Napoleon I. Now Napoleon III is likely in power. I think that's where we are in the timeline, but they might correct me in a moment. That essentially we are in the part of the war where the bourgeois government in France has reinstated a kind of monarchy, and the workers had not as much say in this. It is mostly bourgeois Republicans who had a say in this, who were largely pro-monarchist in the first place. And so instead of doing their republic, they chose to opt for a larger monarchy in order to fight the Prussian government. Napoleon III invades France, and this is a absolute failure. He was like, I don't know, trying to do some kind of like rally around the flag thing. He was trying to orient people around him by doing the war. It did not go so well. So here's some of that context in like France starting the war and what happened.
People extremely angry when it became public, and it eventually led to the French mobilizing troops against Prussia in the beginning of the Franco-Prussian War. So this whole scandal over the Spanish throne and the Otto von Bismarck's intervention led to the emergence of this war. So, in declaring war, France actually led to an increase in Prussian power, funny enough, as the independent southern German states, who had previously not fallen under the control of Prussia, decided to ally themselves with the Northern German Confederation to fight back against France.
So now you can see in this map, like, there's a lot of stuff going on here, but essentially the biggest thing is that the northern part of Germany is now the northern part of Germany and the southern part of Germany are somewhat allying together, which means that they have a lot more power to resist France in the bottom left-hand corner. That's really important because the Prussians have a lot of army and a lot of resources, and that's like obviously good for their win in their fight against France.
From the get-go, the Prussians had a significant advantage due to better and more experienced military leadership, and more importantly, they had better rail infrastructure to rapidly move troops and goods wherever they needed to along the line. So the war kicks off, and after several successful Prussian offensives, Napoleon III himself entered the fray at the Battle of Sedan. So this battle was ultimately a huge victory for the Prussians. They suffered only a total of 9,860 casualties, but they were able to inflict 122,000 casualties on the French side, which resulted from Napoleon III surrendering himself and turning over 100,000 troops to the Prussians. So
I want to pause there for a moment. I'm curious if you perhaps were a French citizen at that time and heard that Napoleon III had invaded Prussia and lost like 10-1 troops versus Prussia. How are you feeling right now?
I'd be like, bruh.
Bruh is a good response. Yeah, you're probably pretty pissed because the other thing is that the bourgeois Republicans at the time are also raising massive funds for the war. We have to remember that at this time in history, they were kind of coming off of the, medieval era and the sort of feeling of medieval war. But remember that like modern warfare doesn't technically start until like World War I. So they're still fighting in a pretty ceremonial way. The idea that you lose 10-1 troops is absolutely terrible. And it also demonstrates that he played his chess pieces wrong, because this was a time when like war was definitely ceremonialized and that they had been doing war for centuries. So they all knew how to come to the battlefield and point muskets at each other and just stare each other in the face and then fire a bunch of times. So it's like, how did you mess up that badly? It means that you're a bad war strategist and you're also just like a bad person to be leading people. So just wanted to point that out, that like as a citizen, you are feeling absolutely terrible about the situation.
in this battle, the new emperor is defeated and the new empire is crushed and its army is captured. So upon news of this surrender reaching Paris, the French did what they did best, essentially, and they rioted and established a new government. This new government would be the Third French Republic. And this led even further to chaos within France and opened the way for further Prussian offensives.
So note here, once again, it's not just that the French had a bunch of republics. They went monarchy We hate the monarchy. Republic, wait a second, we're going to put the monarchy back in. Monarchy, and now they're going to do another republic. Like, as far as the French citizens are concerned, at least in Paris and Versailles, they're like, what is going on? Like, how are we supposed to do this? And also remember that many of these people who are doing this revolution are not unlike the American Revolution, where it is a bourgeois revolution. It is a revolution of the property owning class. It is a revolution of the people who own most of the stuff, who are able to take power in this instance.
And these events have ultimately culminated in the siege of Paris, which had an absolutely devastating effect on the city. During the siege, the Third Republic moved its capital to the city of Tours in order to begin peace talks with the Prussians, who by this time had unified with the southern German state to found the German Empire. So, quickly, what's really important here is that now there's a new national French government, which is a republic again, that has abandoned the capital of Paris and has moved elsewhere while Paris is surrounded by the Prussians. So, this
and the capital they moved to is Versailles. Note this as well, and I heard this in a different podcast, and it was quite elucidating to this, that the population of workers in France had doubled in the last decade and a half. Doubled. Went from like 500,000 to 1,000,000 and made up an absolute majority across the nation. That is really important for understanding like why being taxed super heavy, fighting a war that's unpopular, killing a bunch of soldiers in that war would be really bad for the French Republic and would be also really bad for the workers, and like why they are wanting to resist. So there's a lot of animosity and also a lot of loss of pride, right? They sent those in the urban areas, right? The farmers that actually technically voted for the monarchy for Napoleon III, they are pissed because they sent a bunch of money to war. They thought the French name was going to go win this war. They thought it was necessary. And then now we come back, tails tucked between our legs, and they literally sieged Paris. That would be like somebody like literally bombing New York City or bombing like San Diego or something like that here in the United States, or bombing DC, burning it. Like we've had events in our own history where that has happened because of the British or whoever has invaded. And what was the American response? Anger. Huge responses. I mean, hell, that someone bombed Pearl Harbor with conventional weapons, and then we turned around and dropped 2 nukes on them. Like, think about this from the workers' perspective at this time. They, even the farmers, the ones who own property as well, they are pissed that this is what's happening, and they feel like that the entire core of France has just been gutted. Has just been gutted by the Prussians.
This is, of course, a lot of historical context that on the surface level might not seem to have a lot to do with revolutionary theory, but thankfully this is where the story starts to get more interesting from our perspective. So Paris at this time had drifted in a particularly radical direction, with an increasingly large proletarian population who sympathized with the radical forms of republicanism. And ultimately, the siege of Paris exacerbated the radical sentiments in the city, as many of the rich and powerful were able to successfully flee before the Prussians had the city encircled, leaving mostly workers and impoverished people behind. And these workers were by far the hardest hit by the effects of the siege economically, and this led to an increasingly fervent radicalism within the city. Furthermore, the First International had been, prominently organizing workers within Paris for striking and other forms of labor organizing for decades leading up to the siege. So there was.
And I want to comment on that. I think if I'm going to correct myself from earlier, I know Nat missed it, but the First International is different from the Communist League. The Communist League is a subset of the International. The First International is the First International Working Men's Association. So that's the Working Men's Association that operates in Paris and elsewhere to organize workers toward the direction of socialism. So that's like this is the association, by the way, that you need to join in order to like essentially bargain for wages and things like that, and also kind of like meet other people and address your concerns. Because to be fair, with all these governmental changes, the International Working Men's Association is the only way to get your voice heard. How can you get your voice heard in a Republican government that literally doesn't talk to you, abandons you from Paris, goes to Versailles, and literally loses a war on your dime? Like, all of those things are demonstrating why the working people are so behind this International Working Men's Association, and why they might be, listening to a lot of the communist arguments. Now, remember, we've progressed like quite a bit in time. We're getting closer and closer to 1971, and note that it's like That's a solid 20 years after the Communist Manifesto is written. So we have to remember that this is like a significant time jump, and also a lot of history is happening between these points that demonstrates why people are getting more radical.
There was already a socialist culture within the city that was now finding itself in this state of crisis. During the siege, the primary defensive force was the National Guard, who were not the main army of the French government, but were a somewhat less disciplined sort of militia force. National Guard units were sort of infamous, actually, for practicing forms of unofficial military democracy, with some units refusing to execute orders without first discussing them internally as a group. And the National Guard in Paris, in particular, was made up largely of working-class soldiers, which kind of contributed to its political radicalism.
And I want to add to this, because I heard this in a different podcast, and this is like probably the last point that we'll make on this historical context, is the really key part is that the National Guard is now made up of a bunch of workers. It didn't used to be. It used to be a sort of like kind of political appointment, but more so a word for like those who were kind of in high society in Paris. It's more like the Royal Guard in Britain is right now. You know, the guys with the funny hats and the red suits. Like that's the kind of National Guard that it was before Paris faced all these sieges and the Republic changed a bunch of times. Now the National Guard is literally just there as a standing army to hopefully protect Paris, but they are largely independent, as you can hear, like even some units saying that we have to decide this internally before we're going to just obey your orders. These units are largely independent of some kind of national system that directs them on what to do. These are almost average, probably, you know, closer to middle class, like petty bourgeois type workers, ones who are likely in the category of artisans and trade workers and those kinds of things. They are the ones who are a part of this International Working Men's Association, who are also then a part of the National Guard. So they take a lot of pride in being a part of the National Guard. They take a lot of pride in the fact that they are the, you know, sort of last defense for Paris, but they are also independent of the Parisian military. So this is where we're going to see the source, the kernel of where that insurrection for the Paris Commune comes from.
So again, we have Paris surrounded by the Germans, with much of its upper class and government officials fleeing, leaving behind workers and an army and militia that are mostly made up of radicals themselves. So in addition to all this, radicals noticed during the siege that the French government in the city was quite weak and had very little defensive forces left. And in response to this weakness, National Guard units from primarily working-class neighborhoods mobilized and marched on the city center to demand the formation of a new revolutionary government in Paris. Ultimately, this protest failed, and it was followed by several other protests which made similar demands. Despite the fact that these protests on surface level were immediate failures, they did lay the groundwork for something else. They demonstrated that an armed contingent of the working class was willing and able to mobilize within the besieged city. These protests also coincided with the Germans successfully cutting off telegram communication between the city and the rest of France, which led to several military officials leaving the city, further weakening the government's control over Paris.
And that's key too. This Parisian isolation, I want to hammer home. The broader rural the broader rural France voted to keep up the monarchy in part because many of them were not toiling workers in capitalist factories. They felt that they owned most of their stuff because they felt more close to feudalism. They felt they were closer to their land or their property and ownership and power because they could vote and all of those things. So they largely supported the monarchy. Paris was very different, an urban center, not unlike the ones that we have here in the United States, where, like in New York, it is a blue spot in the middle of a bunch of red, where like upstate New York is largely farmers who voted for Trump. And the same is here in Kansas, where like Kansas City is a bunch of like Black and people of color who are particularly, stuck in the industrial district and facing pollution and those impacts, and are largely, liberal or left leaning in that section, where they're surrounded by a sea of red almost on all sides by these states, because those are the rural workers who largely own property and feel that they have more say, largely white landowners and things like that. So in a similar scenario, you have these landowners work their farms, have pride in their country, blah, 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 outside of Paris. They don't know what's going on there because they can't get any communications. They don't have telegrams, whatever. And most of the government's already fled to Versailles. So Paris is now this isolated segment of France, has felt the real impacts of the Prussian War, and is like, what is going on and what are we going to do about it?
So eventually, the National French government signed a ceasefire with the German Empire, leading to an official end of hostilities. Despite this, Paris had still been largely vacated by the military and government elites, and the radicals there ended up having plans of their own. The National Guard still maintained control over much of Paris, and intent on establishing a national revolutionary government, they set up cannons in the working class neighborhoods as a form of self-defense. This put the Guards at odds with the national government's chief executive, Adolphe Thiers. Ultimately, Thiers decided to mobilize the army to seize the cannons and to disarm the revolutionaries. And on the 18th of March, the National Army was mobilized into Paris to grab the cannons, which resulted in an exchange of fire with the National Guard Brigade and the death of one National Guardsman. So here we see the crisis sort of evolving, where it's no longer the French fighting the Germans, but the French fighting themselves over control of Paris.
I want to highlight the cannons here. The National Guard, and I learned this from some other sources, that it's like the National Guard owned their cannons. The cannons were bought as like a kind of like, not necessarily like a coming of age thing, but it's more so like they owned a lot of their weapons and their gear and made a lot of it themselves because they were the working men of Paris and were not connected to the national system of military. So it's not like the Bank of France was just like bankrolling all of their uniforms and all their stuff was owned by Paris. It was all owned by them. So there's actually some letters and demands that goes about and some protests about how your attempt to disarm us as the National Guard is disarming the working class, is disarming the workers who worked for this stuff and put it on the streets to defend Paris. We are defending Paris because we are Parisians. And so that strong sense of patriotic identity plus the material investment that they have in the region demonstrates why they would be so opposed to the military just coming in and taking their cannons, because the military is like, what do you need your cannons for exactly? I mean, you've kind of protested about 2 or 3 times now. You probably don't need those, right? Like, I think we're probably okay. We could just take those from you. Like, obviously they're going to say no. Obviously that's like not a thing that they want to be, participating in. So that's like, this is the big context. There's about 1 more minute that I'm going to play of this, and then we'll be done with this particular set of context. And then we'll get into a big discussion about the Paris Commune, what you read about it, and all of those things. But I just wanted to be clear. There is clear indications and obvious like scientific understandings that we can get to of just like, if we see the anger here in this instance, people are angry. They have been told by their government that things will be fixed, and they are not. They have been, harmed by being the bankroll for the government, and they have toiled and toiled and toiled under capitalism and see that it is failing in front of them. And so now this radical sentiment plus the literal direct confrontation with the military, that they're done with it. They are just sick of it.
Although the National Army was able to capture some of the cannons, the National Guard rallied to fight back as crowds attacked the National Army soldiers. The Guard successfully captured General Jacques-Léon Clement Thomas, and the Guard, who had significant animosity towards him for his treatment of the soldiers, proceeded to execute him quite brutally along with another general, shooting each upwards of 20 times. The National Guard then seized the Hotel de Ville, forcing Thiers to evacuate all National Army troops from Paris. And at this point, at least from a de facto perspective, the revolutionaries had control over the city. In response to this evacuation, the National Guard mobilized to secure control further. They grabbed access to supplies of gunpowder, they captured police stations, and they set up a central committee in the recently captured Hotel de Ville. That day, the red flag was actually raised over Paris. The Central Committee of the National Guard then declared itself the legitimate authority in Paris and seized government buildings. On March 26th, the Central Committee held elections to establish a new revolutionary government. And despite the national government urging citizens to refuse to participate, nearly half of the population of Paris turned out to vote, leading to an establishment of a 60-person council with 15 members having been affiliated with the Socialist First International. And so the Paris Commune was founded.
So I want to stop there. Because I think we can do a lot more work with our discussion, and I am curious, how do we feel about this context? How do we feel about this context? Is there anything that I can clear up or any questions that I can answer before we move on to the next part of this? Okay. Yeah, that's fine. If we don't have any questions, I can move on to the next thing. So now we're at the point that the First International is like only partially in control of the Paris Commune. Remember that at this time, commune does not mean communists. The Paris Commune just means a parish, a city council, if you will. Commune literally in French just means like city council, or council, if you will. So when they say the Paris Commune, they literally just mean the Paris City Council. It's not that the Paris Commune is some like, broad, at least at this exact moment, is some like, oh, sweeping introduction of communist ideas into this utopia that was built and founded by communists. No, this was built and founded by a bunch of Republicans who were largely radical for their time, plus some communards, which were also part of the International Workingmen's Association, the 15 members that were described. So given that context, I want to ask, like, what are some key takeaways that we all got from the Paris Commune reading that we did from Marx and the Civil War in France?
I mean, the quote, "The commune was the direct antithesis of the empire," I feel like sums it up. Like yeah, like they sorry, I can't. They were unhappy, and then they were like, you know what we're gonna do? We're gonna fight back, and we're gonna do like the opposite. We're gonna like be egalitarian, and yeah, that was my biggest takeaway, was that quote, honestly.
Egalite, fraternité. I forget what the other one is. Is it Egalite, fraternité, liberté? That's of course. Why would I forget freedom? Oh, I'm a socialist. So yeah, no, it's those kinds of values that they were trying to enshrine. Mikey, did you have any thoughts?
I've already discussed how I didn't do it. So
Yeah,
I will say that as you were talking about that, I realized I actually did know a little bit about this period that I thought I didn't know. First off, for Prussia, Prussia was like it was entirely a military state. Like everyone was in the military. First off, it had a very large military. I can't remember if it has been called, I can't remember if it is a contemporary quote or something that I listened to, but it's like, has been called, a military with a plot of land. It's so, very much a military superpower. So it makes complete sense that Napoleon got his ass handed to him and he tried to invade because, like, obviously it's Prussia. Other thing is that, that's what I was going to say.
Okay. Gabe and William, do either of you have like what do you think that takeaway was from reading particularly the section on the Paris Commune? What do you think Marx is trying to get at by doing this review of the Paris Commune? Now that you've seen, like, here's the historical context, here's all the shit that led up to it, and what they were trying to do, what does Marx say about it?
So I guess my two takeaways from it is the first one is it's kind of funny that France loses to Prussia, and then immediately there's like, oh, okay, now's their chance to get rid of our second emperor, Napoleon, and have Republicans in charge and democratize a little bit more, everything. And then you have the Paris Commune. It's like, oh, we should become even more rational, revolutionary and do these things. They're like, whoa, hang on a second, that's too far, So it's very interesting of like, kind of, I don't know how to describe it quite, but it's like, oh, we should incorporate some changes. And when there's another group that's like, okay, yeah, that's the right thing, but not enough. Like, oh yeah, we can't do that. And so that kind of dynamic of being like conservative liberal ideologies, in the traditional sense of
Yeah.
kind of like upholding the status quo, but sort of incorporating some changes, and then the second takeaway is I think I can't remember where it's mentioned, but trying to find the quote again. The part where you can't use the institutions of the state.
Yes, this is where he says that you can't just repurpose the tools of the existing state. That you have to fundamentally transform them.
The working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes.
Yeah, exactly, that one. And so I think that was also very important, is that, again, the Paris Commune was on the right track and they did a lot of correct things, but at the same time they were trying to, at the end of the day, using state, already created state institutions and things, and so it just didn't pan out. So those were my kind of two takeaways from reading it.
That's great. That's great. Before we address some other points, I wanted to kind of hit a couple of things that I had in my notes that I didn't quite get to in the intro that I just played. Is note that for the timeline of this, the majority of this timeline, as far as what angers workers pretty acutely, is 1869, 1970, and 1971, which means within 3 years, within less than a presidency here in the United States, these people got like drastically shifted in their material situations and responded fairly quickly. In fact, there's even some reports that like the main leaders in the International Workingmen's Party were genuinely asleep when most of the like Paris Commune stuff was established, because they genuinely didn't know what was going on. They did not know it was happening. They didn't know the revolution was happening, and they slept through it. Like, it is baffling to me in some ways that that's possible, but of course it makes sense in this time where like most things are getting sent to each other by mail and carrier pigeon. It's like you're not going to get information all that fast, and it's not like they had notifications that like on Twitter, hey, we're live and having a revolution. Like, that's just not happening. So the revolution's definitely not televised, and the National Guard wasn't expecting to take over the government that day. It's just that the military stormed in and they were like, no, screw you. So that also leads to what the Communist International were talking about. Is like, don't disarm the working class, because the working class was the one building up a lot of this national pride and material goods to resist these things. In 1870, there's actually an event that wasn't mentioned in the context that I think is really important. A journalist was assassinated by the government because after they had held a basically dictatorship-like election where Napoleon III was, I think it was Napoleon III was reelected in this election, where it was essentially rigged. Like the whole election was set up so that the working class would lose, and essentially after this, a journalist gets assassinated for criticizing the government. And you know how many people responded? About 10% of the population of France responded to this. This is equivalent to the same number of people who responded in the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020. Like, I want you to reckon with that for a moment, that like 30 million people in the United States is equivalent to the same number of people that protested at the time, like proportionally. So this was huge for people. And the fact that it wasn't mentioned is interesting, but I think it's because like militarily this isn't as relevant, but it is a show of how in 1870 people were pissed. And then in 1870, later on, this is when the Prussians actually surrounded Paris because they had lost about a bunch of people during the war, and Bonaparte officially loses the war. So 2 days later, that Third Republic comes into being, but obviously that Third Republic is like not great and is not doing their job. And so the Third Republic actually says, quote, "You are wrong. We must remain united, make no revolution." These leaflets are passed out to the workers in the middle of Paris. And it's like the workers are looking at this document going, wait, we're supposed to be having a revolution? Wait a second. What do you mean don't have a revolution? You just told me not to have a revolution, so I think I should probably have a revolution. Is the kind of thinking. Yeah, this is like when Trump gets up there and says like, don't protest in LA because guess what? We're gonna crack down on you. Like, don't do it. Don't you do it. Like what?
What person is gonna like planning on revolting, right? And then somebody tells them, hey, don't do that. And they're like, oh, okay, I won't do it now because you said so. Like,
yeah, and I want to be clear. The Republican government, this Third Republic that's established, is quite literally calling itself the government of self-defense. The Prussians are sitting on the Parisian border of the city of Paris. They have not left France, by the way. They are sitting on the Parisian border watching this all go down as the Third Republic goes, no, guys, I promise. We are the party of self-defense. We are here to win the war. And it's like, what war are you winning? The workers are so confused at this point as to what these bourgeois Republicans are actually going to do. So I just thought that was kind of useful to contextualize. Now leading up to 1871, they are very mad. They are well aware of their material situations. They are all radical and largely Republican, and some of them communists, and they are ready. Also note that the Communist Manifesto gets major printing during the 1870, during 1870 to 1871. Major printing. It gets translated into French. It gets translated into Russian. It gets translated in, in various places. I think it also gets translated into English about a decade later or something like that. But there might be some English copies around. I doubt it because English is not that popular and the UK wasn't super involved. But anyway, you can look this up. The point is that the Communist Manifesto is being passed around. It is finally resurging this document of power for the Parisians in 1870. So in 1871, they revolt. The National Guard says, screw you, we are taking this over. And now we get to the point where they have established a government. It is a duly elected government with full universal suffrage for men. I want to be clear about this. They have full universal suffrage for men, which is extremely radical from before. And they are specifically governing over Paris. So they do a few things. One, they set up a commune so that city council, if you will, that has a bunch of seats available to cover all of the different areas of Paris. These Parisians are elected by the public, and there's even some historians out there who are like, honestly, most people didn't know who they elected to office because these were like gennaro workers who just happened to be like good workers at factories. Like these representatives at the commune were not like people who knew politics or anything like that. These were average, everyday people who were like, republics are good. So I want to be clear that this is definitely a workers' government. They have now seized control of the state and most of its machinery. But there are two things that they haven't done. One is they refuse to seize the bank. The National Bank of Paris, the National Bank of France is in Paris. And they send a guy to go do it. And he decides not to after some convincing. So they don't have a bank. They don't have money. The best thing they have is the people. They have the National Guard, which could maybe provide some defense. And they have lots and lots of demands. So they institute universal male suffrage. They institute a lot of their demands. They do a real transformation of what French society looks like. And the rest of France has no clue. Like Versailles knows, some other places know because they were like are writing letters, but this new government is huge. Marx actually goes there and visits for a while. There's some books written about that you can research. And if you want to know more about those, I can talk about them. But I want to talk about what does Marx say about potentially some of the demands of the commune or some things that he says that is good about the commune. Can we identify any of this? Feel free to get it out, the Paris Commune. It's not that lengthy, but it's quite important. Yeah, William, I don't know what to say about the National Bank. Engels criticizes when he publishes the 1878 redistribution of the Civil War in France. He adds a preface that says, I read all this stuff and I just cannot believe that they did not take the bank. Like that was one of his huge criticisms of the Paris Commune in that introduction.
I think one of the things that he highlights is that this is the first revolution, quoting from it, this is the first revolution in which the working class was openly acknowledged as the only class capable of social initiative, even by the great bulk of the Paris middle class. And so I think that's one of those things where sometimes you don't have to be necessarily the best, you just have to be first. And so I think in this circumstance, it's like this was the first time that was like acknowledged, and it was actually the workers that were taking charge.
Yes, very much so. Marx is obviously a big fan of that, but it also demonstrates the kind of like science of Marxism and what is said in the Communist Manifesto, which is like that through all of history, it is guided, it is guided by the course of the oppressed class. And what ends up happening is that history is marshaled by those revolutions, so that the transitions in history are marshaled by the revolutions of the oppressed class. Think about the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie under feudalism were the artisans and the thing makers, if you will, the ones who maybe didn't own much property. They weren't feudal lords, but they certainly owned a lot of the markets, right? The markets, and they had the ability to sell to their fellow laborers. So those are the kinds of things we have to think about when we're thinking about the transition between feudalism and capitalism and why the bourgeois are what they are. And so then we think about the workers and they're like, okay, yeah, this new situation kind of sucks. And they are truly revolutionary because they take this state machinery and they're like, okay, well, we're done doing the shit that they were trying to do. We're going to do things like the judiciary and educational institutions. And I'd love to hear more. Sarah, did you find something?
Something that I thought was interesting. They stripped the police of their political attributes, and then they are just an agent of the commune. And then it says officials of branches of administration. Wait, hold on. Let me just read it. Officials of all other branches of the administration, from members of the commune downwards, the public service had to be done at workman's wage. I thought that was a very important attribute of it, is that like all officials like make what a worker would make.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
I don't know.
The working men's wage, the universal suffrage, the leveling of the playing field, so to speak, with all of these things. The judicial functionaries were to be divested of the sham independence, which had served to mask their abject subserviency. Like, this is Marx going, this is some shit right here. Like, that
Yeah.
is Marx saying, this is the stuff we want to be doing.
Yeah.
While he has some criticisms of it, I think the real key is like when he says that you can't just take the ready-made state machine, he's saying things like disbanding the standing army is critical. I think that Lenin elucidates this a lot. Engels talks about this a lot. That the state itself and the fact that it has this standing reserve army that is not necessarily made up of the working class, but is rather made up of, for example, the police, who are a force that is above the citizen and above the law, and is this special force of the state, is uniquely problematic and is what sets up the conditions for bourgeois reproduction and its ability to continue forth despite what the workers may say. And it is particularly true to remember that them abolishing the standing military was already largely fled, right? The national government takes over this place, and all they have to say is just like, we're just not going to have the military. I was listening to some other sources, and they were like, basically the way the commune transitions power is they force one of the Republicans from the Third Republic, who happens to still be in Paris, and like literally drags him into the room, makes him sign a document that says this is now the Paris Commune and they own all the shit now, instead of the Third Republic, and renounces things like the Guard and says they'll all go home and whatnot. This is like an actual Republican who was like marshaled into a room and was told, no, you're signing this document now. We own this shit. That's the kind of like revolutionary spirit that was going on in this moment. And they managed to keep this up and kept meeting for about every couple of weeks, a week or two. And many people were voting and deciding on resolutions and making these reforms over the course of about a month and a half. So are there any other things that we wanted to talk about with the potential successes or contributions to the Paris Commune that might have made to the people? Sarah?
I have another thing, the religious aspect of it.
Yes.
So priests, it says priests were sent back to the recesses. Like, they had complete separation of church and state. Their focus was on like education for all and science and stuff. And I was just like, is this another thing where it's like this was completely radical for the time, or what? Like, given the time and place of all this.
Abso-freaking-lutely, it was
Yeah.
radical because the Parisian government was very much tied to the church, and the church was a way of establishing political and social power. That's where a lot of the Republicans came from. They were like, some of them were priests. The other thing that was interesting is that many of the ones who were elected to this commune were actually priests themselves. So it's interesting that they passed these resolutions, because what the priests were saying is these are working men's priests. These are not priests of the official church. These are priests who are like in and among the working class and are trying to find reconciliation, find a place within the working movement. And so when they are sort of abolishing this, priests or heads of state, thanks, Gabe. It's good to see you here. But when they're trying to abolish these conditions of social repression via the government and religion in particular, that is certainly radical for the time. And this relates to what a lot of people misquote Marx for saying, is that he just wanted the abolishment of religion because he thought a religion was the opiate of the masses. What Marx says about religion, and what the communards were saying about religion, and they were right about this, is that it is not the opiate of the masses because religion is bad on its own. It is the opiate of the masses because it is what alleviates the workers' feeling of animosity within a class society, and it signals their bereftness, their feelings of horrid conditions under the capitalist system, and allows them to kind of put those energies elsewhere. So when they're abolishing the priests as a political arm of the state or as endorsed by the state, that is a really important development, because it shows that they are like, no, we want to address workers' concerns directly. We don't want to go through God or whoever else is, going to be that middleman. It is that we want to address the workers' concerns and their conditions right here, right now. So really powerful stuff there. Okay. We could talk about the successes all day, but there's obviously some reasons why Paris fell. Did anyone get a chance to read The Fall of Paris? No? Okay. You could watch a million different videos on why Paris fell. There's even, I have a video pulled up right now that's like the 6-minute history summary video. That's like, hey, Paris fell because they were all randos and stuff. But really, there's like no one good answer as to why the commune fell. Sarah?
I think the 6-minute video that you're talking about got deleted from YouTube.
Oh, really?
From the time that you posted it.
Are you talking about the summary of the Civil War in France? That video?
Yeah, never mind.
That's different. This one,
okay.
This one is like a cartoon video that I watched like yesterday and today. That's like, here's the reason that the commune fell, and most of it, like, you could agree, you could disagree, but I think that there are some conclusions that are common. One is that Marx is right. You can't just seize the ready-made state machinery. You have to transform it. Part of this is losing the bank. Some leftists will say, well, not getting the bank is enough to cause their failure. Incorrect. The bank was still potentially controllable by them, but also the bank wasn't that full either. The coffers had just been spent on war, and most of that money was going to the military and not the people. And what were they going to do? Pay a bunch of the workers, and then what? And then what? Like, what were they going to do? Set up a new special standing army? And then what? It's like, all of these things are, what are we supposed to do with that machinery, and how are we supposed to transform it in our own interest? Another thing that was set is that, like, they don't have a clear and absolute political line. This is something that I didn't get much time to talk about earlier, but I want to talk about now, and I've been dropping seeds of it throughout this talk, is there is so much internal division about what politics looks like in the future. Majority of the International Working Men's Association and the majority of this commune are what are called Blanquists. They follow Blanqui, who is a French philosopher of anarchism at the time. He is in a tradition of Proudhon and some others who were developing anarchist thought. He thought that the Paris Commune should represent a facet of an independent working government that only is there to sort of organize the resources of people, and then tangentially relate it to itself to a potential national orchestrated network, a diffuse, a non-central network of other city-states, if you will, that are sort of working together in this economy. He thinks that all of the like little villages and towns in France should be their own workers' councils, and then each of those workers' councils should like meet every once in a while to talk about what they need from one another. And like that's the utopian socialism that Engels is criticizing, is that Blanqui and Proudhon think that spontaneously will emerge this sort of perfect organization of society eventually, that the people will just sort of realize what conditions that they need to have, and that there needs to be no real leader in that sense. Of course, anarchists oppose hierarchy, but particularly for the Blanquists at that time, they were thinking that this government is a representative of that sort of decentralized model. And so this breaks down a lot of the ways that they could possibly defend from outside attacks, for example, from repression of the French government, which is a large cause of their downfall. I wish I could spend a lot more time on, the actual material conditions and the history of the downfall of the Paris Commune. You'll have to like look at other sources for that at other times. But I think the biggest takeaway that we can literally hear when we are reading Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific, when you are reading the Paris Commune by Karl Marx, and when you are reading the Civil War in France or any of these other texts, you notice that like they are learning in real time that you need a communist party, as is said in the manifesto, that is able to guide the working class, not be outside of it, not special, right? A part of the working class, but is able to spend its energy on doing that studying, that political studying, and being able to guide the working class in the direction that it needs to go in order to achieve its ultimate goals of, universal suffrage or equality, fraternité, liberté, those kinds of things. And so that's where the International Working Men's Association comes in, where it's like, okay, the Paris Commune eventually fails, in large part because of internal inconsistencies, a large part because of its decentralized nature, in large part because it didn't, seize all the machinations of the state that were necessary to defend itself, and also just like the lack of organization broadly. So given a lot of these conditions, the Paris Commune fails, and now we're at the position of what do we do with this? Do either of you have, or anyone in this room, have an idea of what should we think now? Like, what did you get out of this, or what do you think we should be getting out of this Paris Commune experience? What should we understand about it?
I think we can understand it in much the same way as we understand utopian socialism generally, as one of the things that sharpened our understanding of our, as a collective proletariat, our understanding, and Marx specifically, our understanding of the opposition to capitalism and how the opposition to capitalism should look. It kind of proved that that kind of thing can happen. That the workers are the only class capable of social change, or whatever that quote was. But also that there needs to be some material grounding, even more material grounding to the action.
Yeah, Sarah.
Can you what was the original question?
Yeah, what is it that we're supposed to gain from all this, basically? Like, what do you think that we're supposed to? If you were telling somebody, some stranger on the other end of this camera, right? What should they be learning from
this? What should they be learning from this? Damn. I don't know. I'm like brain farting right now.
That's okay. If you aren't exactly sure, that's fine. We can, I can just give the little bit that I have. William,
Yeah.
Did you have a thought on what you think the key takeaway is?
Be vigilant, and be very vigilant in circumstances such as the Paris Commune was experiencing, and also you spoke of political divisions and whatnot. United we stand, divided we fall, and yeah, I think that's probably to make things very concise.
Yeah, Sarah.
And the quote that we already talked about, the one where you can't just like replicate what the state was doing before. You have to break free from that pattern and actually have people govern themselves, stuff like that.
Yeah, I think we've hit on the two things that I want everyone to take away from this is like, we don't need to idolize the commune. I can send videos afterward, but there's this really good talk, even though they're a Trotskyist organization and I have my own opinions about that. There's a pretty good, where is it? It's this video called Storming Heaven, the Paris Commune by the Revolutionary Communist Party. They are Trotskyists, so they have a different view on some of these like issues of what we should do about socialism and what our plan going forward is. But I think that Storming Heaven podcast actually has a really good description of like why the Paris Commune is so important to study and why it is a really cool thing to think about. It gets to these two things, which is one, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. That's the first line in chapter 1 of the Manifesto, Bourgeois and Proletarians. It's saying that we have to understand all of history, including events like this, through the analysis of class. And if you notice, as I was doing all of the history context, I was giving you the explanation of like, think about what it feels like to be a worker. Think about what it feels like to be the bourgeois. Think about what it feels like to be in these positions at this time. And then you come to your own conclusion. And I imagine it's possible that you were predicting what was going to come next, that they were going to get more mad, they were going to get more frustrated, that revolutionary spirit was going to build, and that they would decide to change their material conditions. Those things are predictable because we can study them through this class analysis. And so when we study the Paris Commune, we learn not only a lot about this class analysis, but what it means to us now as going, we are in a class society. We are in a similar class society in the sense that we are in a capitalist class society. And what does that mean for our movements? How do we do a similar kind of analysis, get some kind of success, and move forward from that? And then the second thing that you mentioned, Sarah, and so did you, Mikey, and other places in this conversation, is that the state in particular, and this is an idea we'll elucidate later in other education sessions, but I want to be explicit now with Marx and Engels have a lot of work to do with regard to what the state is, means, and does. Lenin develops that a lot better, at least in my opinion, or more later on in things like the State and Revolution and the October Revolution, his experience as an organizer. But he's drawing from Engels' early works on the origin of the property, the family, and the state, right? That these early works, like the Manifesto, where they are, and the Paris Commune and its failures. Lenin even writes on the Paris Commune and talks about why he thinks it failed. So it's clear that this event is important to study, not just for the context of the utility of the Manifesto and how it genuinely influenced people moving forward and being like, I'm a communist now, we are going to stage this revolution. That's why 15 people out of the 65 or whatever got elected as communards. It's important to note that as we're developing ideas about the state, that we have to look to not only past experiments, but also think through the science of socialism to determine what the state should look like, how we should seize that power, what that power gets transformed into, and then what we use that power for. Because Marx says in the Manifesto that, like, okay, great, the proletarians seize power, right? Now what do they do with it? The question is, the proletarians, when they take power and do the thing that is the dictatorship of the proletariat, what does that look like and what do they do for themselves? Well, that should be entirely guided by the needs of the proletariat at the time. And so in the Paris Commune, we see that emerging as like a kind of Republican government. We see that emerging with the ideas of anarchism that were quite popular at the time, trying to influence a government getting out of your life kind of thing. That's a lot of the ideas that are floating around and emerge in this new government. So while it only lasts about a month and a half, it is really important to study as it shows the kind of value of the Manifesto, shows the value of this class analysis, shows the value of Marx and his critique on the state. And if you want to read more about all of this stuff, I think the Paris Commune is a good way to learn what Marx was thinking at the time, evolving in his opinions about what the state could and should be for the socialist movement. So that's all I have for today. Thank you all so much for participating in this discussion. It was lively. It was fun. I really appreciated it. I think we all learned something from each other in our own readings, and I hope that was good. So I'm going to stop the recording. I appreciate you all being here, and thank you so much.